This is a 25 marker from Edexcel Paper 3. It reads, evaluate the likely microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a rise in interest rates in Turkey. I'm going to sort of give you an outline for how I would answer this question. My suggestion is always take a look at the question, maybe have a go at answering it yourself, and then comment whatever you come up with, and we will can have a look at that and see how it compares to what I've written here. So what I've done, because this is a paper 3 and we've got some extracts, I've sort of pulled what I think is the key information from those extracts so you can sort of have access to it while we're going along. The first is that the Turkey Central Lending Bank rate is at 24%. That's extremely high. And that's a significant jump from the roughly 8% that it maintained until 2018. So you can see that here, right? This is the rate at which commercial banks can borrow from the central bank. And that's going to have a big influence on interest rates generally in the economy. If the interest rate for the central bank is higher, it's going to mean that interest rates in the economy, the interest rate on your credit card is higher, for example. 24% is extremely high. Sort of for reference, I'd kind of expect the bank rate to be like 1-2%. Two, the Turkish lira exchange rate with the US has fallen by 50% compared to USD, which is much more extreme swing compared to other countries. You can see that here as well. The Argentine peso is the only one that's more extreme. They have hyperinflation. So this is a really significant collapse in the value of the lira. And then also we've got the annual inflation rate of 25%, and that we're going through a severe economic adjustment. That means people's standard of living is falling. And it kind of is a suggestion that the inflation rate issue is maybe starting to come down. So we get that kind of with 4, which is that the currency is stabilized, but the government wants to further reduce interest rates in order to fuel borrowing. So they want to borrow more money. And we've got the question here is the effect of a rise in the interest rates in Turkey. So I'm going to look generally to do a microeconomic point and a macroeconomic point. My microeconomic point here is that a rise in interest rates is going to increase borrowing costs for businesses. And my macroeconomic point is going to be that this will lower investment. And we'll break that down a bit because it's not necessarily a super clear picture with investment, but we'll get to that in a second. For the topic, I'm going to do some definitions. I'm going to want a diagram. I'm going to want application and analysis and an evaluation. And I want that for both, and then we'll do a judgment at the end. So the analysis here is basically like higher central bank rate leads to higher interest rates in the economy as a whole. That's because commercial banks need to make a profit on the rate that they are borrowing from the central bank. So they're generally going to set a higher interest rate so that, if they're borrowing at 3%, they lend to us at 4 or 5%. So that 2% is their profit margin. And then that's going to increase the cost of borrowing for businesses, specifically the cost of servicing debt. So this is if you have debt as a business, there's a minimum monthly payment you need to meet. So if you've got like a credit card that's very similar, you have to meet a certain minimum payment that is tied to the interest rate. Basically, you've got to pay the interest on a monthly basis to keep the debt. And that's without really paying down the debt. So if you've got, say, £1 billion of debt as a business, if central bank rate goes up and interest rates go up in general, that's going to increase the cost or the amount of money that you have to pay on a monthly basis. So that's an increase in fixed costs, which should do a couple of things. One, it's going to increase the break-even point for businesses. So this is basically like how much output do you need to provide in order to break even as a business. And the higher your fixed costs are, the more output you're going to have to produce and sell in order for you to bring in enough revenue to cover your fixed costs, right? So if like for every unit I produce, I bring in £1 of profit or operating profit, then that's and I have like £50 of fixed costs. I need to sell 50 units in order to be able to break even as a business as a whole, because that £1 is basically going to those fixed costs. The higher those are, the more I have to sell. The other thing this is going to do is it should reduce profit margins for businesses, and then that in turn should reduce dynamic efficiency in the long run as businesses neglect investment in innovation. Right, so if we have a smaller profit margin, maybe we're able to invest less. We'd also expect this could drive up prices for consumers. Again, if they're passing on that cost to consumers, you can talk maybe a little bit about price elasticity of demand here. But basically, that's a few different areas of analysis you can put together for increased borrowing costs. For the diagram, I know it's something that looks like this. This is what I picked. This is for a monopolistic competition. And we've got the sort of the increase in the average cost and how that eats into the profit margin of the business. So we used to have a profit margin that was A plus B. Now we have a profit margin that's just A because our average costs are higher. So I'll just make that a bit smaller so it all goes together. For definitions, I might define things like fixed costs. I might talk about price elasticity of demand. I might talk about supernormal profit. You might talk about different market structures. So, if you want, again, it's like how much time do you have? You could say, part of this in the evaluation, maybe whether or not costs are passed on to consumers depends on market structure and on price elasticity of demand. Firms may retain profit if the market allows them. So basically, if they don't face too much competition in the market, maybe they are willing to put up prices because they know that customers are willing to accept those higher prices. And then the effect is that you are maybe able to retain your profit margins as a business, but the costs go up for consumers. So this is like, I guess, then you're reducing consumer surplus. Again, that might be part of the analysis. I might say economic conditions like inflation might mean that businesses avoid investing in innovation anyway, preferring to save their profits for a rainy day, right? So this is basically like, the conditions in the market mean maybe like regardless of the interest rate, you're just not getting very high levels of investment or innovation. I've done the diagram. The application, I would say we could put in the lending rate as our application. And if you want, you can include maybe the inflation rate. If you're doing that here, you could include your inflation rate with the evaluation if you're going to focus on inflation as maybe a different explanation for why you're getting low rates of business expansion investment. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the financial sector. This, I think, is going to be maybe the more challenging analysis for a lot of people, because it can be a bit confusing because you might think, well, and this is something we do in our evaluation, higher interest rates mean a higher savings rate, which might mean then you have more investment available or a larger investment pool in the economy. And that certainly is sort of one thing that could happen. You might also say that higher interest rates, one of the things you might be tempted to say is, well, if interest rates are higher, doesn't that mean that like there's more of an incentive to invest in assets that are providing that interest rate? So you'd think like, well, why won't we lend more to the government because that's a more attractive interest rate? And that is true, but not all investment is going to assets that provide that kind of return. So I might say investment goes more towards assets that offer a fixed interest rate. So this would be bonds, government debt, etc. This means there's less investment available for businesses, stocks, investment projects like infrastructure projects. In other words, what I would say is when you have higher returns, that's generally going to encourage investment to go towards, say, the interest rate on government bonds. So you're more likely to lend to the government and less likely to lend to the private sector. So there's generally like investment is moving towards assets that are providing that higher return, and they're moving away from things that we might consider more economically productive. Like it might be more useful for us to have investments focused on the private sector, on boosting economic growth, and instead it's going towards the safer assets in the economy. So I'd say other factors like price instability might encourage investment to safer assets. So part of this is like, where is the investment going? Not just like how much investment is there in the economy overall. I would also say that higher interest rates lead to worse business performance in terms of returns because fixed costs are higher. So I'm referring to the argument I've just made, right? Fixed costs are higher. This means that returns on investment in the private sector are worse for investors than if interest rates were lower. And this would lead then to less interest in investing in the Turkish economy. Finally, I'm going to say putting up interest rates signals a lack of control over inflation and will negatively affect economic growth, which will in turn lead to investors may choose to invest in other countries rather than Turkey. So it's kind of like, this would be like an animal spirits type argument where investors are really concerned about the future of the Turkish economy, and putting up interest rates is kind of a signal from the government. We're really concerned about inflation. You know it's going to have a bad effect on economic growth because you're going to reduce consumption, do all of those things. And so this maybe makes investors really nervous about the economy. Ooh. I'm going to let that pass. And then that means there's going to be less investment overall. So you can argue this both ways, and I do understand why for some people it will seem like doesn't higher interest rates increase investment. I would argue in this case it's going to decrease investment. You don't need this level of analysis. I know I've given you sort of 3 different arguments, but I think it's important to outline like why this is happening, what is affecting the level of investment. These are quite advanced points as well. I'm just sort of trying to give you lots of tools that you could use on the exam. Don't take this as I need to write this level of analysis in order to get full marks or anything like that. I'm just trying to outline some options for how you can make the argument, and also one option for evaluation. And if you wanted to, you could make the argument that this would increase investment because you're increasing the savings rate. But I don't think that generally fits this case. And I would make the argument too, if you're going, and here's where you bring in the application, if you're going from like, 24% up to, I don't know, 25%, if people were going to save, they'd have saved at that rate, right? So like, I don't know that you're necessarily at a point where people are sort of teetering on the edge of deciding to save or not. So that's why I don't think it's going to drive up investment through the sort of Howard-Dormer model component. But yeah, this is a complicated topic. If you have questions about these arguments, I'll do my best to answer them in the comments. I'd also say like I might include the context here about currency instability, because that's also a reason why maybe investors would already be a bit concerned about the economy. And so an increase in interest rates would just tip them over the edge about deciding not to invest in Turkey. And then for the diagram, I'm going to show something like this with a decreasing aggregate demand leading to a decrease in national income along the bottom, because ultimately investment is a component of aggregate demand, right? So that's going to be the argument basically for when you get the decline in investment. Here's how this is going to hit the price level. Here's how this is going to hit the level of economic output. So we'd expect a leftward shift in aggregate demand is going to reduce your price level, which is good for inflation. But obviously you're also going to have the decrease in economic growth, which is going to be just bad for your economy in general. You'll notice I've also shown a leftward shift in long-run aggregate supply. That is completely optional. I've added that just because in the long run, if you've got decreasing levels of investment in your economy, you would expect that to affect your capacity over the long term. And what that does is I think it shows maybe why decreasing investment could also have the effect of driving up prices in the long term. So you can see sort of P2 to P3. That's coming because if we're not getting investment in our road infrastructure, we're not getting investment in our ports, we're not getting investment in our schools, over time, our capacity as an economy is going to shrink. And then for definitions, you could define AD and its components. You could define sort of the role of the financial sector. You could look at defining things like interest rates, like bonds. I mean, there's tons of stuff for this topic. And then in terms of a final judgment, I would say increasing interest rates does not make sense in Turkey, given currency levels have already stabilized. Rather, it could halt economic recovery as it damages investment levels and the performance of businesses that are no longer able to borrow money. Yeah, and then that would be the argument. Obviously, you could also talk about things like consumption. Like, there's tons of arguments here that you could make. And I'd be super curious to hear what you guys come up with.